The world for Oberleutnant zur See Klaus Richter had shrunk to the smell of diesel fuel and the sickening taste of salt water. It was May 12th, 1943, and the vast, cold expanse of the North Atlantic had, in a matter of minutes, become his grave and then, impossibly, his salvation. Just hours earlier, he had been the master of U-178, a steel wolf hunting beneath the waves. Now he was a prisoner, huddled in a rough wool blanket on the pitching deck of an American destroyer escort, the USS Bogue. His uniform, soaked and reeking, clung to him like a second, colder skin. Around him, the surviving members of his crew, boys barely old enough to shave, stared with wide, haunted eyes at the American sailors, who moved with a casual confidence that Klaus found both infuriating and terrifying. Every beat of the ship's powerful engines was a hammer blow, driving him further from the fatherland and deeper into the unknown. What he thought he knew of that unknown was a tapestry of horrors, woven by the masterful hands of Dr. Goebbels' propaganda ministry. He expected to land in a country of gangsters and degenerates, to be handed over to vengeful Jewish interrogators, to be starved and beaten in a forgotten camp until he confessed to crimes he didn't commit. This was the promised fate for the proud soldiers of the Reich who fell into enemy hands. The propaganda films had been very clear, showing sneering American captors and hollow-eyed German prisoners. He braced himself for the inevitable brutality, the first strike that would signal the beginning of the end. Instead, a young American sailor with a friendly, freckled face approached him, holding out a steaming mug. The sailor said something in his strange, lilting English, a language Klaus only partially understood, but the gesture was universal. It was hot coffee. Klaus stared at the mug, then at the sailor's face, searching for the trick, the hidden poison, the cruel joke. There was none. It was just a simple, human offering against the cold. He took it, his hand trembling slightly, the warmth of the ceramic, a shocking comfort. He couldn't believe it. This small act of kindness was more disorienting than the depth charges that had cracked his U-boat's hull. It was the first crack in the wall of his certainty, the first suggestion that the world he was entering was not the one he had been prepared for. The journey across the ocean was a blur of dislocation, but it was the arrival in America that truly began to shatter his reality. Disembarking at Norfolk, Virginia, under the watchful eyes of armed guards, Klaus and his men were herded towards a train. They saw no bombed-out buildings, no ration lines, no grim-faced civilians. Instead, they saw docks piled high with crates of food and machinery, cars that gleamed in the sun, and people who, despite the war, did not seem to be suffering. The guards weren't the snarling brutes from the newsreels. They were mostly older men, reservists with stern but not cruel faces, who chewed gum and spoke in low, calm tones. The fear remained, a cold knot in Klaus's stomach, but it was now laced with a profound confusion. This deep-seated fear was not accidental. It was a core component of the Nazi war machine, a psychological armor forged for every German soldier, sailor, and airman. The Reich's propaganda apparatus, under the meticulous control of Joseph Goebbels, had spent a decade painting a portrait of the United States as a corrupt, decaying, and fundamentally weak society. It was, they were told, a mongrel nation, a chaotic mix of races lacking the purity and discipline of the Aryan people. American men were depicted as soft, materialistic, chewing gum soldiers, more interested in jazz music and Hollywood movies than in the hard virtues of sacrifice and martial glory. Their industrial power was dismissed as a house of cards, propped up by Jewish financiers and built on the backs of an exploited, immigrant workforce that would crumble under the first real test of war. Soldiers like Klaus Richter were repeatedly shown films of American poverty, of the Great Depression's breadlines and the Dust Bowl's migrant camps, presented as the daily reality of American life. They were told that the American government was a puppet of international Jewry, and that its entry into the war was not a matter of principle but of profit. The stories that circulated among the U-boat crews were even more specific and terrifying. Captured German sailors, the rumors went, were handed over to ruthless intelligence officers who used horrific methods to extract information. After that, they would be sent to brutal labor camps, no better than those in Siberia. where they would be worked to death under the whips of cruel guards. This carefully constructed narrative served a dual purpose. It not only bolstered morale by painting the enemy as inferior, but it also stiffened resolve, making surrender seem like a fate worse than death. It was better to fight to the last man, to go down with the ship in a final, glorious act of defiance, than to fall into the hands of such a depraved and vengeful enemy. Every German soldier carried this mental picture with him into battle. It was a lens through which they viewed the world, a filter that colored every interaction. For Klaus and his crew, this was not just propaganda, it was the truth. They had no reason to doubt it. The world outside of the Reich was a dark and dangerous place, and America was its most monstrous and deceptive inhabitant. They were utterly unprepared for the reality that their captors were operating from a completely different set of principles, one born not of ideological hatred, but of cold, hard pragmatism and a revolutionary kind of psychological warfare. While Germany was building a prison of fear for its soldiers, America was building a very different kind of prison for its captives. The American approach to prisoners of war was not born in a propaganda ministry, but in the quiet, calculating offices of the Provost Marshal General's office in Washington, D.C. The official policy was simple. The United States would adhere strictly to the 1929 Geneva Convention. Prisoners would be treated humanely, housed in safe and sanitary conditions, given adequate food and medical care, and allowed to write letters home. But beneath this veneer of international law lay a deeper, more audacious strategy. America in 1943 was a nation transformed into a vast arsenal of democracy. But this transformation had created a critical weakness, a severe labor shortage. With over 12 million men and women in uniform, farms, factories, and forests were desperate for workers. The solution, as army planners saw it, was sitting in newly constructed camps across the country. Hundreds of thousands of healthy, disciplined German prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention permitted the use of enlisted prisoners for labor, as long as it was not directly related to the war effort and was not dangerous. They could work on farms, in canneries, in lumber mills, and on infrastructure projects. For this work, they were to be paid. The wage was minuscule 80 cents a day, paid in canteen scrip, not cash, but the principle was revolutionary. It was this detail, the concept of paying the enemy, that separated the American approach from all others. It was an idea that a mind steeped in National Socialism could barely comprehend. But the strategy went beyond simply plugging a labor gap. A few forward-thinking officials in the military and state departments saw the POW program as a weapon of ideological warfare. They believed that the best way to defeat Nazism was not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of the German soldiers themselves. This secret re-education program was subtle and unofficial at first. It was based on a simple but radical premise. Instead of telling the Germans that democracy was superior, they would show them. They would dismantle the lies of Goebbels not with counter-propaganda, but with undeniable reality. Let the prisoners see the vast, productive, and peaceful American heartland for themselves. Let them experience the sheer abundance of a nation that could wage a global war while its citizens still enjoyed a standard of living unimaginable in Europe. Let them interact with ordinary Americans and see that they were not the monsters of the newsreels. As the train carried Klaus Richter and his men deeper into the American interior, they became unwitting students in this grand experiment. From the grimy windows of the rattling train cars, they stared out at a landscape they couldn't believe. They crossed mile after mile of rich farmland, where neat, painted houses stood proudly amidst fields of corn and wheat. They saw no fortifications, no columns of marching soldiers, no signs of the total war that had consumed their homeland. They saw children playing in schoolyards, women hanging laundry on the line, and farmers driving tractors across endless fields. Every town they passed, with its bustling main street and its church steeples reaching for the sky, was a silent refutation of everything they had been taught. The train, for them, was a conveyor belt moving them from one reality to another, carrying them from the claustrophobic certainty of their U-boat into the heart of an enigma. They didn't know where they were going, only that every mile they traveled made the world feel stranger. And the fear in their hearts was slowly being replaced by a bewildering and even more unsettling emotion: doubt. The train journey ended not with a crash, but with a long, mournful sigh of air brakes that seemed to echo the deflation of their own expectations. The heavy doors of the boxcar slid open, flooding the stale, cramped interior with a rectangle of brilliant, almost violent sunlight. For men accustomed to the perpetual twilight of a submarine and the grey, overcast skies of the North Atlantic, the intensity of the light was a physical blow. Squinting, Klaus Richter stepped down onto a wooden platform and was struck by the sheer scale of the emptiness around him. They were in a place called Kearney, Nebraska. The name meant nothing to him. It was just a flat, sun-baked landscape that stretched to a horizon so distant it seemed to curve with the earth itself. The sky was an immense, cloudless blue dome, a terrifying inversion of the crushing depths he once commanded. There was no city, just a small, sleepy town in the distance. The air didn't smell of coal smoke and industry, but of dust, dry grass, and something else, something clean and fertile. A group of American soldiers, looking more like farmhands in uniform than the elite shock troops of propaganda, lethargically directed them into columns. As they marched the 2 miles to the camp, a few local people stopped to watch. Klaus saw farmers in dusty overalls leaning against pickup trucks, their faces weathered by the sun, their expressions not of hatred or anger, but of a kind of slow, bovine curiosity. A group of children on bicycles pedaled alongside them for a short while, gawking as if they were creatures from a travelling circus. The prisoners, in turn, looked back with a mixture of arrogance and suspicion. These were the people who were supposedly their mortal enemies? These simple, sunburned peasants? A few of his younger crewmen snickered, whispering jokes about the farmers' patched clothing and ancient-looking vehicles. They couldn't believe this was the mighty America. It looked backward, provincial, and weak. This initial impression only hardened their disbelief. The entire situation felt like a poorly staged play, a facade designed to fool them. The camp itself, Camp Kearney, was another shock. Instead of the barbed wire hellscape they had braced for, they found a neatly laid-out grid of single-story wooden barracks, painted a drab but clean olive green. There were watchtowers, yes, and fences, but inside, the grounds were orderly, with gravel paths and even small patches of grass struggling to grow in the dry soil. It was Spartan, but it was not a death camp. They were stripped of their uniforms, subjected to a delousing procedure that was humiliating but efficient, and given a surprisingly thorough medical examination by an army doctor who seemed more concerned with their dental health than their political ideology. They were issued new clothing, blue denim work pants and shirts, with the large white letters PW stenciled on the back and pant legs. The first meal they received was another moment of profound cognitive dissonance. They were served beef stew, thick slices of white bread with butter, potatoes, and a mug of hot, sweet coffee. It was more food, and of a better quality, than most civilians were eating back in Germany. The men ate in a stunned silence, their hunger warring with their suspicion. Every spoonful felt like a trick. Every act of mundane, bureaucratic decency felt like the prelude to some unimaginable horror. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the friendly masks to be ripped away, revealing the snarling monsters beneath. They were certain it was coming. For the first few days, they were left to acclimate, performing menial tasks inside the camp, tidying barracks, digging ditches, peeling potatoes in the mess hall. The routine was monotonous. The guards were distant, and the initial terror began to curdle into a tense, simmering boredom. The hardline Nazis among the crew, led by a petty officer named Metz, did their best to maintain discipline, organizing morning calisthenics and singing patriotic songs. They warned the others not to be fooled by the Americans' apparent softness. It was a Jewish trick, they insisted, designed to weaken their Aryan resolve. Klaus, as the senior officer, found himself in an impossible position. He had to maintain the morale and discipline of his men, but he was just as disoriented as they were. Nothing made sense. The Americans' behavior was illogical. It lacked the righteous fury of a nation at war. It was also casual. The moment that shattered everything came a week after their arrival. The entire German contingent of the camp, several hundred men from various sunken U-boats and a few captured Afrika Korps soldiers, was ordered to assemble in the central square under the hot afternoon Sunday. They stood in nervous, shuffling ranks as the camp commandant, an American colonel named Davies, walked to a small wooden platform. He was a tall, lean man in his 50s, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to see right through them. He spoke through a translator, a young American sergeant who spoke fluent, unaccented German. Colonel Davies began with the expected boilerplate about the rules of the camp and the articles of the Geneva Convention. The men listened impassively. This was familiar territory. Then, the colonel's tone shifted. He began to speak about the local economy. He spoke of the harvest, of sugar beets and corn, and of the severe labor shortage caused by so many young American men being away at war. Klaus could feel the confusion rippling through the ranks. What did any of this have to do with them? The colonel paused, letting his words hang in the dry air. Then he delivered the blow. Starting next week, the translator's voice rang out, clear and precise. Enlisted prisoners of war will be detailed for agricultural labor on the surrounding farms. You will assist the local farmers with the harvest and other necessary tasks. A low murmur swept through the crowd. This was it. The slave labor they had expected. They were to be reduced to field hands for these American peasants. A grim satisfaction settled over some of the men. Their darkest predictions were finally coming true. But the colonel wasn't finished. He held up a hand for silence. For this work, the translator continued, his voice steady, you will be compensated. You will be paid 80 cents per day for your labor. Silence, not a murmur, not a cough, just the sound of the wind whistling through the barbed wire fence. 300 German soldiers stood frozen, their faces a collective mask of utter, absolute disbelief. Paid? The word did not compute. It was an anomaly, a piece of data so alien it crashed the entire system of their understanding. They stared at the colonel, then at the translator, as if he had just announced that the sky was green. Why would they pay them? Why would an enemy nation give money to its captives for their labor? It was insane. It violated every known law of conflict, every principle of conquest. You do not pay your slaves. You do not compensate your vanquished foes. You exploit them. You crush them. Klaus Richter felt a wave of vertigo, as if the solid ground beneath his feet had suddenly turned to liquid. He saw Petty Officer Metz's jaw hanging open, his face a comical picture of shock. He saw younger sailors exchanging wide-eyed, uncomprehending glances. This was a weapon they had never encountered. It wasn't a bomb or a torpedo. It was an idea, an act so fundamentally contrary to their worldview that it felt more destructive than any explosive. It didn't attack their bodies. It attacked their minds. It attacked the very foundation of the ideology that had brought them here. That night, the barracks were a bedlam of frantic, whispered debate. Metz and his followers were apoplectic. "It is a trick," he hissed, his face contorted with fury. "A Jewish trick to make us soft. They want to turn us into capitalists. We must refuse. We must resist." But his words lacked conviction. How could you resist being paid? Others were simply baffled. They gathered in small groups, trying to dissect the Americans' motives. "Perhaps they are fools," one suggested. "Rich, decadent fools who do not understand the nature of war." Or perhaps, a quiet voice offered from the corner, the propaganda was a lie. The statement fell into the tense room like a stone into a silent pond. To even suggest such a thing was heresy. But for the first time, it didn't seem entirely mad. Klaus lay on his bunk, staring up at the wooden planks of the ceiling. He felt as though he had been hit by a depth charge, not one that cracked the hull, but one that had silently imploded the very compass by which he navigated the world. He thought of the friendly sailor with the coffee, the endless fields of corn, the well-fed children, and now this absurd, unbelievable offer of payment. They had been prepared for cruelty, for brutality, for hatred. They had no defense against this. They had been captured by an enemy they were beginning to realize they never knew at all. The first morning of labor began with a tense, defiant energy. As the German prisoners were marched out of the camp gates and loaded onto the back of canvas-topped army trucks, they felt a resurgence of their old military discipline. Petty Officer Metz led them in a rousing, if slightly off-key, rendition of a German marching song. It was an act of defiance, a way of reminding themselves and their captors that they were still soldiers of the Third Reich, not common labourers. The American guards, mostly older men from the local National Guard, simply watched them with a kind of weary amusement, chewing their tobacco and leaning against the truck cabs. The prisoners expected to be driven to some vast, state-run collective farm, overseen by whip-wielding government agents. Instead, the trucks rumbled down dusty country roads and began to stop, one by one, in front of modest, white-painted farmhouses. At each stop, a small group of prisoners, usually 8 to 10 men, was ordered to disembark. There, they were met not by a government official, but by a single farmer. These men were often middle-aged or older, their faces deeply tanned and lined by years of working under the prairie Sunday. They would nod curtly at the American guard, sign a form on a clipboard, and then lead their assigned prisoners towards the fields. The guard would often just find a shady spot under a tree to sit, his rifle propped beside him, and proceed to read a newspaper or doze. The prisoners were stunned. There was no phalanx of armed overseers, no brutal kapos. Their supervisor for the day was a single, unarmed civilian who looked like he could be their grandfather. For Klaus Richter and his group, assigned to a sprawling sugar beet farm, their new boss was a man named Olsen, a stoic Swede-American who spoke little and communicated mostly through gestures. He demonstrated how to properly thin the beets, a back-breaking and tedious task, and then simply set them to work, moving down the long rows under the immense, empty sky. At first, the men worked with a sullen, resentful slowness. This was beneath them. They were skilled sailors and warriors, not peasants. But the sun was hot, and the work was undeniable. Slowly, the rhythm of the labour took over. They fell into a trance of pulling, chopping, and moving. Around noon, a moment occurred that was, in its own quiet way, as shocking as the offer of payment. A woman, Olsen's wife, emerged from the farmhouse carrying a large wooden tray. She walked right up to them, smiled, and offered them sandwiches, thick slices of roast beef on white bread, and tall glasses of ice-cold lemonade. The men froze, looking from the food to the woman to the distant, sleeping guard. They couldn't understand. Was this another trick? A test? But the woman's smile was genuine, and the farmer simply nodded, taking a sandwich for himself. Hesitantly, they accepted the food. The lemonade was tart and incredibly sweet, a taste of unbelievable luxury. The sandwich was hearty and delicious. They ate in silence, sitting in the shade of a cottonwood tree, feeling the profound strangeness of being fed by the enemy in the middle of a field. The act of sharing a meal, a simple human ritual, felt more subversive than any underground resistance. At the end of the long day, as they were herded back onto the truck, sore and filthy, Olsen approached the American guard and handed him a list. Later that evening, back in the camp, they received their first payment. It wasn't cash, but scrip small paper coupons that could be spent at the camp's canteen. Klaus held the small slip of paper in his hand. 80 cents. It was a paltry sum, but it felt as heavy as gold. It was tangible proof. The Americans had kept their word. That 80 cents could be exchanged for cigarettes, for candy bars, for soap, for Coca-Cola. It was the key to a small but significant world of personal choice and minor luxury that they had thought was lost to them forever. This experience was not an isolated anomaly in Kearney, Nebraska. It was the blueprint for a nationwide system of staggering scale and efficiency. This was the true shock. The Americans hadn't just stumbled upon a clever idea. They had industrialized it. From 1,943 to 1,945, over 425,000 prisoners of war were interned in the United States, in over 500 camps spread across the country, and the vast majority of them worked. In the forests of Wisconsin and Minnesota, German prisoners, many of whom had been loggers before the war, felled timber that would be turned into paper and building materials. In the vast canneries of Indiana and Ohio, they processed the very same vegetables they had helped harvest, contributing to a food supply so immense it could feed not only America and its armies, but its allies as well. In the cotton fields of Mississippi and the peanut farms of Georgia, they provided the manual labor that kept the agricultural heartland pumping. The American war machine wasn't just about building tanks and planes. It was a holistic system that could absorb its enemies and turn them into a productive part of its own economic engine. The process was a masterpiece of pragmatic organization. Farmers or companies would contract with the government for POW labor. The military would transport the prisoners, provide minimal oversight, and handle the payroll. The system plugged a vital labor gap, boosted the economy, and, almost as a side effect, began to systematically deconstruct the prisoners' Nazi ideology with every 80-cent workday. It was a form of conquest so subtle and so total that the Germans didn't even realize they were being conquered. They thought they were just earning cigarette money. The ultimate symbol of this new, incomprehensible reality was not found in the fields, but in the workshop. Many of the U-boat crewmen, like Klaus, were not simple sailors. They were highly skilled technicians, diesel mechanics, electricians, and engineers. They understood complex machinery. One sweltering afternoon on Olsen's farm, the rhythmic work was interrupted by a loud bang and a plume of black smoke. Olsen's tractor, a green and yellow John Deere that was the lifeblood of his operation, had shuddered to a halt. He spent an hour trying to fix it, his face growing redder and his curses more elaborate with each failed attempt. The German prisoners watched with a detached, professional interest. They could see the problem. It was a simple fuel line blockage, something they could have fixed in 10 minutes in the cramped engine room of a U-boat. But this was an American machine, an enemy machine. Their duty was to let it rust. Yet, the sight of a broken engine was an offense to their very nature as engineers. Olsen, finally giving up in disgust, threw a wrench to the ground and looked over at the prisoners. He saw the way they were watching him, the knowing looks on their faces. In a moment of pure prairie pragmatism, he walked over to Klaus. "You," he said, pointing at the dead tractor. "Can you fix?" The question hung in the air. Metz, working in a nearby row, shot Klaus a venomous look. To help the enemy, unthinkable. But Klaus looked at the tractor. It was a magnificent machine, a symbol of the very power that had defeated them. To bring it back to life felt less like an act of treason and more like a challenge. He nodded. Olsen led him and two of his best engine mechanics to the machine. Without a shared language, they communicated through the universal vocabulary of mechanics, pointing, gesturing, grunting. They opened the engine cowling, their hands moving with an innate confidence. They diagnosed the problem, cleared the line, and tightened a loose fitting. Olsen watched, stunned by their speed and efficiency. After 20 minutes, Klaus wiped his hands on a rag and nodded to Olsen. The farmer climbed into the metal seat, hit the ignition, and with a cough and a sputter, the engine roared back to life, settling into a steady, powerful hum. A slow grin spread across Olsen's face. He looked at the three Germans, a new respect in his eyes. He disappeared into the farmhouse and returned a moment later with 3 glass bottles, condensation beading on their dark, curved surfaces. He handed one to each of the men. It was Coca-Cola. Klaus held the cold, sweating bottle. He had heard of this drink, seen it in American magazines. It was a symbol of the decadent capitalism they were supposed to despise. He popped the cap, and the fizz was a small explosion. He took a sip. It was cold, sweet, and utterly delicious. It was the taste of a world he didn't understand, a world with so much sugar and leisure that it could afford to bottle it and sell it for a nickel. That tractor, and the bottle of Coke that followed, became the defining symbol of their captivity. It represented an America that didn't operate on ideology, but on what worked. An America that didn't care that they were the enemy, only that they could fix a machine. It was a nation so confident in its own power, so drowning in its own abundance, that it could afford to be generous. It could pay its enemies to repair the very machines that generated its wealth, and then reward them with a sugary soft drink. In that moment, holding that bottle, Klaus knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. They were never going to win this war. The first hints of this bizarre American strategy began to trickle back to Germany not through official intelligence channels, but through the highly censored letters the prisoners were allowed to send home. The German censors, trained to spot coded messages and military secrets, were initially baffled by what they were reading. The letters from America were strange. They didn't speak of torture or starvation. Instead, they contained confusingly mundane details. A son would write to his mother in Hamburg, telling her not to worry, that he was getting plenty to eat. A sailor would ask his wife if she could send a photo of their child, mentioning that he had earned enough scrip to buy a chocolate bar. A soldier from the Afrika Korps would describe the vast, flat emptiness of a place called Texas and the strange music the locals listened to on the radio. Read individually, these letters were just mildly confusing anomalies. But when the intelligence analysts at the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, began to collate them by the thousand, a disturbing pattern emerged. The prisoners in America were not suffering. In fact, they seemed to be working and being paid for it. The initial reaction within the German High Command was one of sheer disbelief and contempt. The reports were dismissed as a clumsy, almost laughably transparent American propaganda effort. "They think we are fools," one general scoffed in a meeting. "They believe we will fall for this fantasy of a workers' paradise for our captured men." Goebbels' propaganda ministry immediately classified the information as a Gräuelmärchen, an atrocity fairy tale designed to weaken the resolve of soldiers at the front by painting a false picture of benevolent captivity. They assumed it was a lie meant to encourage surrender. The idea that the Americans were actually paying German soldiers to work on their farms was so fundamentally alien to the Nazi worldview, so contrary to the master race ideology, that it was deemed a logical impossibility. An enemy did not pay you, an enemy exploited you. A superior race did not compensate an inferior one for its labor. To believe otherwise was to question the very foundations of National Socialism. But the evidence kept mounting. Intelligence reports from neutral diplomats and intercepted American radio broadcasts began to corroborate the letters. The most undeniable proof came from the repatriation of a handful of severely wounded prisoners through the Red Cross. These men, once back on German soil, were extensively debriefed. They spoke, with a kind of dazed wonder, of the clean camps, the abundance of food, and the 80 cents a day. They described the American farmers, the tractors, and the Coca-Cola. Faced with this irrefutable testimony, the German High Command could no longer dismiss it as a lie. The confusion curdled into a cold fury. They realized they were facing a new and insidious form of warfare, one they had no ready defense against. It wasn't an attack on their cities or their armies, but on the very minds of their soldiers. In response, they launched a desperate counter-offensive. The SS, in collaboration with military intelligence, began an operation to re-establish ideological control within the American POW camps. They activated hardline Nazi party members among the prisoner population, men like Petty Officer Metz, smuggling in orders through coded letters and diplomatic pouches. The directives were clear: resist, sabotage, maintain Aryan honor. The prisoners were ordered to refuse to work. They were to engage in slowdowns and organized disruptions. They were to destroy farm equipment and contaminate harvests. Above all, they were to reject the decadent luxuries offered by their captors and remember that they were soldiers locked in a battle for their nation's soul. The campaign was an utter and complete failure. It collapsed against the simple, unshakable wall of American pragmatism and human nature. The order to refuse work was met with open derision by the majority of prisoners. Why would they refuse? The work, while often difficult, was a release from the crushing boredom of the camp. It allowed them to be outdoors, to feel useful, to regain a small measure of dignity. And, most importantly, it came with a paycheck. The abstract concept of Aryan honor seemed pale and distant when compared to the tangible reality of a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes or a Hershey's chocolate bar. Sabotage attempts were few and far between. Most of the men were skilled technicians who took a professional pride in their work. The idea of deliberately destroying a well-made machine like a John Deere tractor was abhorrent to them. Furthermore, acts of sabotage would invite punishment and likely result in the loss of their canteen privileges, a price few were willing to pay. The Americans had created a system where cooperation was rewarded and resistance was pointless. They didn't need whips or attack dogs. They controlled the prisoners with coffee and donuts. For the hardliners like Petty Officer Metz, this was a slow and agonizing psychological unraveling. He watched in horror as his authority, once absolute in the claustrophobic confines of the U-boat, evaporated under the Nebraska Sunday. His attempts to organize morning drills were met with groans and excuses. The men were more interested in comparing their canteen purchases than in singing patriotic songs. He saw them talking and even laughing with the American farmers, developing a grudging respect for their work ethic and their simple decency. He saw them reading American magazines, looking at the advertisements for cars and refrigerators with a kind of childlike wonder. They were being seduced, not by propaganda, but by the undeniable evidence of a better life. The most crushing blow for Metz was seeing the younger sailors, boys he had trained, begin to adopt American slang and mannerisms. They were losing their Germanness, their hardness. They were becoming soft, just as Goebbels had always warned. He would try to lecture them, to remind them of their duty to the Führer, but they would just look at him with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Relax, Metz," a young sailor told him one day, patting him on the shoulder. "The war is over for us. Have a Coca-Cola." The comment, meant to be friendly, was a dagger to Metz's soul. It meant they had accepted defeat. They had been captured not just physically, but mentally. The psychological impact extended beyond the fences of the camps, reaching all the way back across the Atlantic. The letters home, while censored, painted a picture of stability and relative comfort that stood in stark, terrifying contrast to the reality in Germany. A wife in Berlin, huddled in a bomb shelter during an Allied air raid, would receive a letter from her husband in America complaining about the heat in Arizona. A father in Cologne, whose home had been reduced to rubble, would read a letter from his son describing a movie he had seen in the camp theater. This created a surreal inversion of reality. The prisoners of war, the captured and defeated, were often safer, better fed, and living a more normal existence than their free families in the glorious Third Reich. This knowledge was a slow-acting poison, eating away at the will of the German people to fight. It suggested that everything their leaders had told them was a lie. If this was how the decadent Americans treated their sworn enemies, then what did that say about the German cause? The entire narrative of Aryan superiority, of heroic sacrifice for a noble destiny, began to crumble under the weight of thousands of simple, undeniable facts delivered by mailmen. The German war machine, built on a foundation of ideological certainty, was being defeated by 80 cents a day and the promise of a hot meal. The story of Klaus Richter and the 80 cents a day he earned in a Nebraska beet field was never just a strange historical footnote. It was a microcosm of the entire Second World War. It was the clash between two fundamentally different worlds, two opposing philosophies of power, played out not with tanks and artillery, but with tractors and Coca-Cola. The German war machine was built on an ideology of brutal dominance and racial purity. It was rigid, unforgiving, and deeply contemptuous of its enemies. It sought to conquer through fear and crush dissent through overwhelming force. But this ideological purity was also its greatest weakness. It was a brittle system, incapable of adapting, incapable of seeing an enemy as anything other than a subhuman obstacle to be eliminated. The American war machine, by contrast, was a product of a different philosophy entirely. It was messy, pragmatic, and built on a foundation of almost unimaginable industrial might. It wasn't driven by a rigid ideology, but by a flexible, results-oriented approach to problem-solving. Faced with a labor shortage, the American solution wasn't to work its own people to death, but to look at a captured German U-boat crewman and see not a vile Nazi ideologue, but a potential farmhand, a skilled mechanic, an asset to be utilized. This was a form of power the German High Command could never understand. It was the power of a system so confident, so overwhelmingly productive, that it could afford to be humane. It could absorb its enemies, disarm them not with bullets but with beef sandwiches, and turn them into a cog in its own unstoppable engine. The victory wasn't just military, it was a victory of systems. The American system, with its democratic values and its capitalist engine, simply outproduced, outorganized, and outthought its rival. The ultimate demonstration of this chasm between the two nations lay in the staggering, almost science-fictional numbers of American production. While Klaus Richter was fixing Farmer Olson's tractor, the John Deere factory in Illinois was just one small part of an industrial ecosystem that was burying the Axis powers under a literal avalanche of steel. From 1942 to 1945, American factories produced 86,000 tanks, compared to Germany's 46,000. They built nearly 300,000 aircraft, more than double Germany's output. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, a factory a mile long, was rolling a B-24 Liberator bomber off the assembly line every 63 minutes. At the same time, Henry Kaiser's shipyards were launching Liberty ships, massive cargo vessels, in as little as 4 days from keel laying to christening. This industrial tsunami was what allowed America to wage a two-front war on opposite sides of the globe, and it was this same abundance that created the surreal conditions of the POW camps. The endless food, the cigarettes in the canteen, the fuel for the trucks that took the men to work, it was all just overflow, the surplus of a nation operating at a level of productivity that Germany, even at its peak, could only dream of. The German concept of total war meant total societal sacrifice. It meant civilians starving while the army fought. The American version of total war meant that civilians were rationing gasoline and sugar, yes, but the nation was still producing so much that it could afford to ship millions of tons of food to its allies, maintain a high standard of living at home, and provide 3 hot meals a day to its 425,000 enemy prisoners. The Germans were stunned by this. They had been taught that democracy was inefficient and chaotic, but what they saw in America was a symphony of organization. They saw a country that could coordinate the movement of millions of soldiers, manage a global supply chain, and simultaneously run a domestic prisoner of war labor program with quiet, bureaucratic efficiency. They realized they weren't just fighting an army. They were fighting a system of logistics and production, so advanced it might as well have been from another planet. In May of 1945, the news finally reached Camp Kearney. Germany had surrendered. The Führer was dead. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. For the prisoners, the moment was a strange cocktail of emotions. There was the profound relief that the killing had finally stopped, that their families might be safe. But there was also a deep, hollow sense of shame and utter defeat. Everything they had fought for, everything they had believed in, had turned to ash. The months that followed were a period of limbo, but in late 1945, the order for repatriation came. They were going home. The journey back across the Atlantic was the reverse of their first crossing. They were no longer defiant soldiers, but defeated men, sailing towards an uncertain future in a broken land. Klaus Richter stepped off the transport ship in the port of Hamburg, the city of his birth. He had left it as a proud officer of the world's most feared navy. He returned to a necropolis. He stood on a splintered dock and stared at a vista of unimaginable destruction. Entire city blocks were gone, reduced to skeletal ruins and mountains of rubble. The air smelled of damp rot and cold ash. The people he saw were thin, grey-faced ghosts with haunted eyes, shuffling through the ruins in search of food or firewood. This was the reality of the glorious homeland he had been fighting to defend. He saw children with the swollen bellies of malnutrition. He saw women who had lost everything, their faces masks of numb despair. He thought of Nebraska. He thought of the endless fields of green corn. He thought of Farmer Olson's wife, carrying a tray of sandwiches and lemonade. He remembered the casual abundance, the easy confidence, the sheer, solid reality of a nation that could produce so much it didn't know what to do with it all. In America, the enemy was fed. In his own homeland, the civilians were starving. That contrast was the final, brutal verdict. It was the truth that burned away the last vestiges of the propaganda he had been fed his entire life. The Americans hadn't won because they were a master race or because their ideology was purer. They had won because they had built a better system. They had won because they had tractors that could feed the world and factories that could build bombers around the clock. They had won because their society, for all its flaws, was fundamentally stronger, healthier, and more resilient. Years later, and old Klaus Richter would try to explain it to his grandchildren. He would tell them that he was captured by an enemy that stunned him, not with its cruelty, but with its kindness. An enemy that defeated his country not just with bombs, but with an avalanche of food, machinery, and simple, undeniable proof that there was a better way to live. The greatest weapon America deployed in the Second World War wasn't the atom bomb, or the P-47 Thunderbolt, or the Sherman tank. It was the reality of America itself. It was a weapon against which the dark, brittle ideology of the Third Reich never stood a chance. They had expected monsters and found farmers. They had expected slave labor and were paid a fair wage. They had been prepared to die for their beliefs, but they were utterly unprepared for an enemy that would patiently, pragmatically, and profitably show them that their beliefs were wrong. The war wasn't just won on the beaches of Normandy or the plains of Russia. It was also won, quietly and decisively, in a sugar beet field in the middle of Nebraska.